The search dogs stopped without warning. One moment they were pulling hard against their leads, noses low to the ground, muscles tense with purpose, and the next they froze as if an invisible wall had risen in front of them. Their handlers tried to urge them forward with soft commands at first, then sharper ones, but the dogs refused to move. One of them let out a low whine, backing away slowly, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the dark stretch of forest ahead. No one spoke. The Appalachian forest had fallen into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds, birds calling from the canopy, insects humming beneath the undergrowth, wind threading through the branches, were gone. Even the leaves seemed unnaturally still, suspended in the heavy air beneath the dense ceiling of ancient trees. The search leader checked his watch and then looked up at the wall of green and shadow in front of them. This was the point where Henry Knight's trail ended. They had followed his scent for nearly 3 miles, moving deeper into terrain that locals avoided unless they had no choice. The forest here did not open up or invite exploration. It pressed inward, trees growing too close together, roots twisting above the soil like grasping fingers. Sunlight barely touched the ground, filtered into thin, sickly beams by layers of overlapping branches that had been growing undisturbed for centuries. "This doesn't happen," one of the handlers muttered, breaking the silence at last. "Not like this." Dogs didn't simply stop. Not trained once. Not without a reason. The radio crackled softly at the handler's shoulder, a reminder that the rest of the search team was still out there somewhere, spreading farther and farther across the mountain, combing ravines, ridgelines, and old logging paths that hadn't been used in decades. But here, at this precise point in the woods, technology felt useless. The forest absorbed sound, light, and now, apparently, scent. The handler crouched down and examined the ground, expecting to see something: disturbed soil, snapped branches, a drag mark, anything that could explain why Henry's presence had simply ceased. But there was nothing. No footprints, no blood, no sign of a struggle or a fall. Just untouched earth layered with damp leaves and pine needles that looked as though no human foot had pressed into them for weeks. Someone whispered Henry's name, softly at first, then louder, letting it echo uselessly into the trees. There was no answer. As the minutes passed, unease crept through the group, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't the kind of place where people simply wandered off without leaving a trace. Even the most experienced hikers made noise, broke branches, shifted stones. The mountain always left its mark on those who crossed it, and they left their mark in return. Except Henry hadn't. The handler finally stood and stepped back from the invisible boundary the dogs refused to cross. He had the unsettling feeling that whatever lay beyond that point wasn't just deeper wilderness, but something fundamentally different, something that didn't want to be found. High above them, the canopy blocked the sky completely, turning the afternoon into a dim, greenish twilight. It was only then that someone noticed how cold it had become, despite the season, despite the clear forecast that morning. Henry Knight hadn't just gotten lost. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed him whole. Before the mountain erased him, Henry Knight was the last person anyone expected to vanish without a trace. He wasn't reckless, and he certainly wasn't inexperienced. At 38, Henry had spent most of his life moving through these woods, not as a visitor chasing adventure, but as someone who understood their rhythms and respected their quiet dangers. He grew up in the foothills of the Appalachians, learned to read weather changes the way others read traffic signs, and knew when a trail was safe and when it was time to turn back. Friends described him as methodical to a fault. He logged his routes, checked his gear twice, and never relied solely on GPS. A compass hung from his pack strap out of habit, not necessity, and folded topographic maps, creased and annotated, were always tucked neatly into a waterproof sleeve. Henry didn't believe the mountains were out to kill you, but he did believe they demanded attention, and that carelessness was the fastest way to disappear. That Tuesday morning began like dozens of hikes before it. The forecast was clear, the sky a pale, washed blue, and the air carried the early warmth of late spring. Henry planned a familiar loop through a remote section of the range, an area technically open to hikers but rarely used, where old trails blurred into animal paths and the forest seemed to close ranks behind anyone who passed through. This part of Appalachia didn't feel scenic. The trees here were old, far older than the marked trails, and they grew close together, their trunks thick and dark with age. The canopy overhead formed a nearly unbroken ceiling, branches interlaced so tightly that sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. Even at midday, the light felt borrowed, thin and temporary, as though it could be taken away at any moment. The air beneath that canopy was heavy and damp, carrying the smell of moss, decaying leaves, and wet stone. Sound behaved strangely here. Footsteps didn't echo the way they should, and voices seemed to die quickly, swallowed by layers of vegetation. It was easy to feel watched, even when logic insisted there was nothing there. Weather in these mountains had a reputation of its own. Clear skies could turn violent within minutes, fog rolling in without warning, rain appearing from nowhere, temperatures dropping sharply once the sun disappeared behind the ridgelines. Henry knew this. He planned for it. Extra layers, emergency rations, a headlamp even for day hikes. Precautions that others found excessive, but that Henry considered non-negotiable. By late morning, he was deep enough into the forest that the world beyond the trees felt unreal. No distant traffic, no cell signal, just the slow, steady rhythm of his movement and the quiet persistence of the land around him. To someone less familiar, the place might have felt oppressive. To Henry, it was simply demanding. You stayed alert. You didn't rush. And you never assumed the mountain would forgive a mistake. Still, there was something about that day that felt subtly wrong. The forest was too quiet, even for Appalachia. Birds were scarce, and the usual chorus of insects rose and fell unpredictably, as if responding to something unseen. The deeper Henry went, the more the trail seemed to narrow, until it was little more than a suggestion, a faint break in the undergrowth that could vanish entirely if you looked away for too long. By early afternoon, clouds had begun to gather above the canopy, their presence betrayed only by the dimming light and a sudden, restless wind that stirred the leaves high overhead but never quite reached the ground. It was still an ordinary hike. At least, that's what everyone believed, right up until the moment the ordinary world ended. The timeline of that afternoon was painfully ordinary, and that was what made it so disturbing later. At 1:30 p.m., Henry Knight checked in over the handheld radio he carried clipped to his shoulder strap. His voice came through clear and calm, slightly winded in the familiar way of someone walking uphill, but otherwise unremarkable. He mentioned the weather shifting, noted the cloud cover, and joked briefly about how the forest always seemed to darken faster than expected in that section of the range. Nothing about his tone suggested urgency. At 1:47 p.m., he paused to mark his position on the map, standing near a narrow ridge where the trail leveled out before dipping into a shallow ravine. He took a photo, later recovered from his phone, showing a tangle of roots crossing the path and a fallen hemlock leaning at an awkward angle, its bark dark with moisture. The image was unremarkable, except for how close the trees pressed in on either side, as if the path were being slowly erased. At exactly 2 p.m., Henry made contact again. This time, He spoke to a friend who was hiking a separate route several miles away, someone he had coordinated with before entering the backcountry. The plan was simple: periodic check-ins, nothing formal. Henry mentioned that he was about to descend into the ravine and that reception might get spotty for a few minutes. His last words were casual, almost dismissive. "I'll ping you once I'm through the dip," he said. The transmission ended cleanly. No static. No interruption. At 2:05 p.m., the radio was silent. At first, no one worried. 5 minutes in the Appalachians meant nothing. Ravines swallowed signals. Hills bent radio waves into useless shapes. His friend waited, checked his own map, and continued hiking, assuming Henry would call once he reached higher ground. By 2:15 p.m., the unease began to creep in. Repeated attempts to raise Henry went unanswered. The radio crackled briefly with static, but never resolved into a voice. At 2:30 p.m., his friend stopped walking altogether and tried again, this time calling Henry by name. Louder, sharper, letting the sound carry into the trees. Still nothing. By 3 p.m., the situation had shifted from inconvenient to alarming. Henry never missed a scheduled check-in. He never ignored a call without explanation. His friend began retracing his own steps, climbing to higher ground to improve reception, scanning the ridgelines and listening for any sound that didn't belong to the forest. The silence felt wrong. By late afternoon, as the light began to fade under the thickening clouds, the first calls to local authorities were made. Coordinates were shared. The last known position was marked. And with each retelling, the same impossible detail surfaced again and again. Henry had vanished in a window of time so small it bordered on absurd. 5 minutes. He hadn't sent a distress call. He hadn't reported a fall. There was no broken transmission, no half-spoken warning, no sudden burst of panic captured on the radio. One moment, he was there, experienced, prepared, mid-hike on a trail he knew well. And the next, he was simply gone. Not over the course of a night, not after a storm, but in the blink of an eye, in the quiet heart of a forest that seemed far too practiced at keeping secrets. By the third day of the search, hope had begun to thin into something quieter and more dangerous. The initial urgency, the shouting of names, the constant radio chatter, the belief that Henry might be injured but alive, had given way to methodical patterns and grim efficiency. Search grids were expanded. Helicopters traced slow, careful arcs above the canopy whenever the weather allowed, though even from the air the forest appeared impenetrable, a vast, unbroken sea of green swallowing everything beneath it. Nothing turned up. No footprints along the trail. No broken branches. No scraps of fabric caught on thorns. For a man who had disappeared while walking, Henry Knight had left behind an absence so complete it felt intentional. Then, just after sunrise on the third morning, someone found the backpack. It was located nearly 20 miles from Henry's last known position, on the far side of a ridge system that would have taken an experienced hiker at least 2 full days to cross on foot, assuming perfect conditions and a clear trail. There was neither. The terrain between the 2 points was steep and unforgiving, cut through with sheer rock faces, dense undergrowth, and sections where the forest floor dropped away abruptly into narrow, shadow-filled hollows. Even more baffling was where the pack had been placed. It sat on a narrow ledge halfway up a cliff face, a strip of stone no wider than a kitchen counter, accessible only by a near-vertical ascent. There were no climbing anchors nearby, no rope marks, no disturbed soil at the base of the rock. The cliff itself showed no signs of recent activity, its surface slick with moisture and layered with moss that would have been scraped away by even the most careful climb. The backpack was upright, not wedged, not snagged, simply sitting there, balanced as if someone had set it down deliberately and walked away. When a rescue climber was finally lowered to the ledge, the situation grew even stranger. The pack was intact. The zippers weren't torn. The straps weren't broken. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, just as Henry always kept it. His emergency rations were untouched. The thermal blanket was still sealed in its plastic sleeve. The first aid kit hadn't been opened. Even the spare batteries for his headlamp were exactly where they should have been. Nothing suggested desperation, injury, or a prolonged attempt at survival. Most unsettling of all, Henry's boots were inside the pack. Not damaged, not bloodstained, clean. For a long moment, no one spoke as the implications settled in. A man does not remove his boots in the wilderness, not in steep terrain, not in unpredictable weather, and certainly not while moving at speed or under threat. The official report would later describe the find as anomalous. Among the search team, it was described with far less restraint. Some argued that the pack had been carried there by an animal, though no known predator could manage such a task, let alone place it so carefully. Others suggested foul play, but no tracks led to or from the cliff, and the area was so remote that encountering another person there was statistically improbable. Every explanation collapsed under scrutiny. Henry could not have climbed that cliff without equipment. He could not have covered the distance in the time available. And he would never, under any circumstances, abandon the very supplies designed to keep him alive. As the backpack was carefully removed and logged, a realization spread through the group. Quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened to Henry Knight had not followed the rules of the mountain. And whatever had taken him had been thorough. When the search was officially scaled back, the explanations began to surface. They always did. In cases like Henry Knight's, uncertainty created a vacuum, and people rushed to fill it with something, anything, that made the world feel orderly again. Investigators, locals, and armchair analysts alike turned to the most familiar answer first: a predator. The mountain lion theory emerged almost immediately. It was plausible on the surface. Large cats had been sighted in the region before, even if wildlife officials insisted the population was sparse. A sudden ambush could explain the lack of a distress call, the abrupt silence on the radio, the way Henry vanished within minutes. But the evidence refused to cooperate. There were no tracks near the trail. No drag marks leading into the underbrush. No blood on the ground, on the trees, or on the backpack found miles away. Predators were messy by nature. They left signs, even when they tried not to. And they did not, under any circumstances, remove boots, pack supplies neatly, and transport gear across impossible terrain without disturbing a single blade of moss. Next came the fall theory. Perhaps Henry had slipped into a ravine or sinkhole, hidden beneath leaves and shadow. Appalachia was riddled with them, some narrow enough to swallow a person whole. But extensive searches of nearby depressions turned up nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed earth. And again, it did nothing to explain the backpack's location, or the fact that Henry would have had no reason to remove his boots before falling. As each rational explanation collapsed, a quieter conversation began among the locals. It wasn't documented in reports or spoken about at press briefings. It happened in lowered voices, over kitchen tables, and on porches that faced the tree line. People who had lived in these mountains for generations exchanged looks instead of words, as though acknowledging something better left unnamed. They spoke of the silence. Not literal quiet, but a state. Moments when the forest seemed to withdraw, when birds vanished, insects stopped singing, and even the wind refused to move. Hunters told stories of dogs that wouldn't track past certain points. Hikers described sudden disorientation, the sense of stepping somewhere they didn't belong, followed by gaps in memory they couldn't explain. In Appalachian folklore, there were places the mountains claimed. Not violently, not loudly. People simply walked into the wrong hollow, crossed an unseen boundary, and were never quite part of the world again. Sometimes belongings were found later, clean and undamaged, as if returned deliberately. Proof, some said, that the mountain hadn't killed them, it had taken them. Officials dismissed these stories as superstition, the natural result of fear and isolation. But even among the search team, there were those who admitted that the forest had felt different near Henry's last known position. Too still, too aware. Henry Knight was never found. No remains, no final signal, no trace beyond a single, carefully placed backpack on a cliff no man could reasonably reach. His case remains open, categorized as a disappearance under unknown circumstances. And if you ask the people who still hike those trails, they'll tell you the same thing. The mountain doesn't always let you know when you've crossed the line. So the question remains, one no report has ever answered and no theory has ever settled. Did Henry Knight lose his way in the forest? Or did the forest decide it wanted him? In the weeks after Henry Knight vanished, the forest returned to its routines. Trails reopened. Search tape was removed. Official attention drifted elsewhere, pulled away by new emergencies, new names, new coordinates. On paper, Henry's case became another unresolved file, a collection of timestamps, maps, and unanswered questions archived in a system already full of them. But for those who lived near the mountain, the disappearance didn't fade so easily. Henry's name began to surface in conversations that had nothing to do with him at first. A hunter would mention the cliff where the backpack was found and then hesitate, remembering something he'd seen years earlier. A hiker would talk about losing time on a familiar trail, only to realize later that the area sounded uncomfortably close to Henry's last known position. Patterns emerged, not officially, not statistically, but emotionally. A woman from a nearby town came forward with a story she had never shared publicly. Years before Henry's disappearance, her brother had gone missing during a solo hike less than 10 miles away. Like Henry, he was experienced. Like Henry, he vanished in daylight. And like Henry, his boots were later found, placed neatly beside a stream, clean and undamaged, with no sign of injury or struggle. At the time, authorities ruled it an accident. Now, the similarities felt harder to dismiss. Others spoke up, cautiously at first. A former park ranger admitted that there were sections of the forest he avoided entirely, not because of steep drops or wildlife, but because things didn't behave right there. Radios failed without explanation. Compasses spun uselessly. And on more than one occasion, trained dogs had refused to follow a trail past a certain point, reacting with the same fear and confusion seen during the search for Henry. Even those who didn't believe in folklore couldn't deny the odd consistency. Disappearances clustered around specific ridgelines and hollows. Personal items were recovered far from logical paths of travel. And always, there was the same detail repeated across accounts: the silence. That sudden, unnatural absence of sound that seemed to signal something was about to go wrong. Henry's friend, the last person to speak to him over the radio, struggled the most. He replayed the conversation endlessly, analyzing tone, pauses, background noise, anything that might hint at danger. But there was nothing. No warning. No hesitation. Just a man stating where he was, moments before he ceased to exist in any measurable way. Guilt settled in like a second skin. He stopped hiking altogether, unable to shake the feeling that the forest had taken something personally that day, and that returning would be an invitation rather than a challenge. When asked why, he offered no elaborate explanation, only that some places, Once they notice you, don't forget. As autumn crept across the mountains, leaves fell and covered the trails Henry had walked, erasing what little physical evidence remained. The land reclaimed itself quickly, as it always did, leaving behind only stories and the uneasy sense that the disappearance had not been random. It had been selective, and somewhere deep in the Appalachian forest, the conditions that allowed Henry Knight to vanish still existed, unchanged, unmarked, and waiting. In hindsight, the smallest details were the ones that refused to stay quiet. At the time, they were dismissed as coincidence, background noise in a day that had seemed entirely routine. But after Henry Knight disappeared, investigators and friends alike began retracing the hours before his final transmission, searching for anything that might explain how a careful man could simply step out of the world. One of the first things they noticed was the weather report. The forecast had been accurate, technically. No storms, no extreme conditions. Yet multiple hikers in the area that day reported sudden temperature drops around mid-afternoon, cold enough to raise goosebumps despite the season. Some described a thin fog forming low to the ground, not enough to obscure vision, but enough to distort distance and depth, making familiar trails feel subtly wrong. Henry had mentioned none of this. Another detail surfaced from his phone data. His step count showed a brief pause around 1:58 p.m., only a few seconds long, followed by a short burst of rapid movement. It wasn't a sprint, but it was faster than his usual pace, as though he had stepped aside suddenly and then adjusted course. There was no obvious reason for it. No obstacles were visible in the last photograph he took. No steep drop-offs, no fallen trees that would require detouring. Yet something had caused him to stop, then move differently, if only for a moment. The radio logs raised further questions. During his final transmission at 2 p.m., analysts later noted a faint delay between his words, a pause so brief it could easily be attributed to signal interference. But when the audio was isolated and enhanced, the pause remained, clean and deliberate, as though Henry had been listening to something, rather than struggling to be heard. There was also the matter of sound. Several people involved in the search remarked on how quiet the forest had been near Henry's last known location, even before dogs refused to track further. At first, this was chalked up to weather patterns or time of day. But when compared with older reports from the region, the same description appeared again and again, silence arriving suddenly, without transition. Hunters said it felt like stepping into a sealed room. Perhaps the most unsettling detail came from Henry's map. Marked in the margin, near the ravine he was about to enter, was a small handwritten note. Just 2 words, written lightly, almost absent-mindedly. Still here. No one knew what it meant. Henry had a habit of jotting down observations, water sources, trail conditions, wildlife signs. But this was different. It wasn't a location or a warning. It read more like reassurance or confirmation, as though he had momentarily questioned something and needed to anchor himself. When asked about it later, his friend admitted he had noticed Henry making the note during the hike, but hadn't thought to ask why. At the time, it seemed unimportant, harmless. Now, it felt like the last coherent thought Henry had recorded before the mountain erased him. By the time these details were pieced together, the trail was cold, the forest had shifted with the seasons, and whatever Henry might have encountered that afternoon was long gone, or had never left at all. Not everyone who was in the mountains that day spoke immediately. Some didn't realize what they had experienced was connected to Henry Knight until his name began appearing in local news. Others recognized the connection instantly and chose silence instead. In places like Appalachia, people learned early that not every strange moment needed an audience. Eventually, though, a few stories surfaced. The first came from an older couple hiking a well-established trail several miles south of Henry's route. They had stopped for lunch around 2 p.m., settling onto a flat outcrop overlooking a shallow valley. According to them, the forest had gone quiet so suddenly that they both looked up at the same time, struck by the absence of sound. That was when they heard the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It simply appeared, as if spoken directly into the space between them. They couldn't make out words, only the cadence of speech, steady and calm, coming from deeper in the trees. They assumed at first that another hiker was nearby, perhaps talking into a radio. But when they called out, the voice stopped. Moments later, the normal sounds of the forest returned all at once, rushing back in a way that left them disoriented and uneasy. They saw no one else on the trail that day. When shown a photo of Henry weeks later, neither could say for certain whether the voice had been his. Another account came from a solo backpacker camped near an unmarked stream roughly 12 miles from Henry's last known location. He reported waking abruptly from a light sleep in the early afternoon, not from noise, but from the sensation of being watched. The forest around his camp was unnaturally still, the air heavy and cold. He noticed footprints near the water's edge. Bare footprints. They appeared suddenly, as though impressed into the mud between one blink and the next, and they led away from the stream toward dense undergrowth the man would not have attempted to enter without gear or daylight. He followed them for only a few yards before stopping, overwhelmed by an instinctive sense of dread. When he returned with authorities days later, the prints were gone. Perhaps the most troubling testimony came from a volunteer searcher. She had been part of the second-day effort, assigned to a grid not far from the ravine Henry intended to cross. At one point, her radio crackled, not with static, but with a clear, familiar voice calling her name. She responded instinctively, only to realize a moment later that the voice was Henry's, or sounded exactly like it. The call repeated once more, closer this time, before cutting off mid-sentence. When she reported the incident, her supervisor dismissed it as radio bleed or stress-induced misperception. But later analysis found no overlapping transmissions at that time, and no record of Henry's radio activating after 2 p.m. on the day he disappeared. After these accounts became public, they were quickly labeled unreliable. Stress, memory distortion, suggestibility, all reasonable explanations, except for the fact that none of the witnesses knew each other, and none had shared their stories before Henry's case tied them together. Each account stood alone. Together, they suggested something far more unsettling. Henry Knight may not have vanished quietly, and whatever crossed paths with him that afternoon may not have been confined to a single place or a single moment in time. As the stories surrounding Henry Knight's disappearance grew more detailed, authorities felt increasing pressure to respond. Public statements were careful, measured, and deliberately bland. Officials emphasized the dangers of wilderness hiking, the psychological toll of search operations, and the well-documented unreliability of human memory under stress. Each strange account was addressed individually, stripped of context, and folded into explanations that sounded reasonable, at least on paper. The voices heard in the forest were attributed to auditory pareidolia. The barefoot footprints were dismissed as misidentified animal tracks, distorted by water and shadow. The radio transmissions were blamed on signal bleed, overlapping frequencies, or equipment malfunction. Common issues in mountainous terrain, they said. Individually, each explanation made sense. Collectively, they felt inadequate. What troubled some of the investigators was not that people had strange experiences, but how similar those experiences were in shape and timing. The silence, the disorientation, the sense of presence. These elements appeared again and again, not just in Henry's case, but in archived reports from the region spanning decades. Requests to cross-reference those cases were denied. Officially, there was no evidence of a pattern. Unofficially, several lower-level staff admitted that looking too closely at similarities raised uncomfortable questions, ones without clear answers or actionable outcomes. The Appalachian forest was massive, unpredictable, and poorly mapped in places. Acknowledging unknown variables, especially ones that couldn't be measured or controlled, carried implications no agency wanted to manage. So the narrative was simplified. Henry Knight likely suffered an accident. Exposure, disorientation, or a medical event could explain the lack of distress call. The backpack's location was unusual, yes, but not impossible. Weather, wildlife, and terrain could move objects in unexpected ways over time. Case closed in all but name. Yet even as official interest waned, the mountain did not. In the months following the search, hikers reported increased equipment failures in the area around Henry's route. GPS units lost signal entirely. Batteries drained at abnormal rates. Compasses pointed in conflicting directions, sometimes spinning uselessly before settling on headings that led nowhere. None of these incidents were dangerous on their own, but taken together, they created an atmosphere of persistent unease, as though the forest were subtly resisting observation, bending tools and perception just enough to remain unreadable. One internal memo, later leaked, included a line that was never meant for public release. Recommend minimizing presence in Sector HK until further notice. No explanation followed. The sector remained open. Trails were not closed. No warnings were posted. But among park staff, the area acquired an informal reputation. Assignments near Henry's last known location were avoided when possible, swapped quietly, without comment. It was easier that way. After all, acknowledging the limits of explanation meant admitting that something in the forest operated beyond established understanding, and that it had chosen, once, to make a man disappear in 5 minutes of ordinary time. Long before Henry Knight's name appeared in incident reports and news articles, the mountains had a reputation. Not the kind found in brochures or trail guides, but one passed quietly between generations, carried in stories that were never written down because they were never meant to be examined too closely. In Appalachia, history did not begin with settlers or surveyors. It began with presence, with the understanding that the land was not empty when humans arrived. Local historians, when pressed, admitted that early records contained unusual gaps. Journals from the 18th and 19th centuries mentioned expeditions that never returned, mapping parties that stopped abruptly, entire passages blacked out or torn from otherwise meticulous logs. When questioned, archivists often attributed these omissions to weather damage or lost pages, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. The missing entries almost always corresponded to the same regions. Areas marked on old maps with vague annotations, unpassable, unstable ground, or simply left blank altogether. Indigenous oral traditions spoke more directly. Among several tribes native to the Appalachian region, there were warnings about places where the forest listened. These were not sacred sites in the ceremonial sense, but thresholds, areas where one was expected to move respectfully, quickly, and without drawing attention. Lingering, calling out, or naming oneself aloud was discouraged. To be noticed was to invite response. One legend described hunters who followed familiar game trails into a hollow that felt wrong, emerging hours later miles away, barefoot and confused, unable to explain where they had been or how they had traveled so far in so little time. Another spoke of voices that mimicked the living, calling people deeper into the woods under the guise of familiarity. What united these stories was not fear, but inevitability. The forest did not chase. It waited. When modern researchers compared these accounts to more recent disappearance cases, the overlap was uncomfortable. The same sudden silence, the same disorientation, the same recovery of personal belongings in locations that defied natural movement. And always, the same absence of remains. Skeptics argued that folklore naturally evolved to explain danger and loss, that people retrofitted ancient stories onto modern tragedies to make sense of randomness. But even they struggled to explain why so many details aligned so precisely across centuries, cultures, and technologies. Henry Knight's case was not unique. It was simply recent. And that realization carried an implication far more disturbing than any single theory. Whatever existed in those mountains had not arrived suddenly, and it had not adapted to modern times. It had been there all along, unchanged, unnoticed, and patient. Not everyone who crossed the line disappeared forever. The man came forward almost a year after Henry Knight vanished, and only after learning that the case had quietly stalled. He did not contact the media. He didn't seek attention or offer dramatic claims. Instead, he spoke to a local ranger he trusted, someone who had worked in the mountains long enough to know when a story deserved to be taken seriously. He was an experienced outdoorsman, like Henry. He had hiked the same region countless times, often alone, often in silence. He knew the trails, the weather patterns, the places where the ground shifted without warning. And yet, on one late afternoon in early autumn, something happened that he could not explain away. He described the moment with uncomfortable precision. He was walking along a faint, unmaintained path when the forest seemed to tighten around him. Not physically, but perceptually. The light dimmed without clouds. The air cooled. And then, all at once, the sound stopped. No wind. No insects. No birds. He said it felt as though the world had been muted. Ahead of him, the trail appeared unchanged, but wrong in a way he struggled to articulate. Distances felt compressed. The space between trees seemed shorter, as though the forest had folded inward. When he checked his compass, the needle spun, then pointed directly behind him. That was when he heard his name. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It carried the exact tone of his brother, who lived hundreds of miles away and had no way of being there. The call came from off the trail, deep in the trees, and it was calm, patient, and close. The man took one step toward it, and then stopped. He couldn't explain why. He said it wasn't fear, exactly, but a sudden certainty that taking another step would make something irreversible, as if the mountain had noticed him and was waiting to see what he would choose. He remembered Henry Knight then, remembered the story, the time window, the silence, the backpack on the cliff. He removed his pack slowly, deliberately, and backed away without turning around, keeping his eyes on the trees until the trail felt solid again beneath his feet. The forest sounds returned in a rush. He checked his watch. Nearly 40 minutes had passed. When he returned home, he found dirt on his hands and bare feet. He had no memory of removing his boots. He never hiked that area again. When the ranger asked why he waited so long to speak up, the man's answer was simple. Because I don't think it lets you leave twice. Survivors, if you could call them that, did not return unchanged. It wasn't the obvious trauma of hiking accidents or near misses. It was something subtler, slower, and far harder to measure. People who approached the zones where Henry Knight had vanished described sensations that lingered for weeks, months, sometimes years, after they were out of the forest. Some felt a permanent sense of being watched. Not paranoia in the clinical sense, but an intuitive tension, as if reality itself had recorded their presence and would not forget it. Doors closed a little too quietly. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Footsteps echoed behind them, even on quiet floors. Others reported moments of temporal dissonance. A minute could stretch into 10. A conversation might skip seconds that no one noticed. Days could feel compressed, and occasionally, they found themselves staring at a familiar place and realizing that they couldn't remember entering it. Sleep offered little relief. Nightmares were vivid, populated by the same dense forests, the same sudden silence, and voices they recognized yet could not identify. People who had spent years hiking, hunting, or living near the mountains woke in the middle of the night, trembling, convinced they were being called back. One woman, a volunteer on the second day of Henry's search, described a change so profound she hesitated even to articulate it. She said that after spending hours in the woods, she no longer felt entirely comfortable in open spaces. Cities and wide fields seemed unnatural, artificial. She described the world as smaller, somehow, as if the forest had expanded inside me while I was away. Rangers and psychologists alike offered rational explanations: stress, sleep deprivation, or the power of suggestion amplified by the news coverage. But every account contained details impossible to explain with science alone. The exact locations where sound vanished, the feeling of compressed space, the precise moment when the forest seemed to watch. Henry Knight, in this sense, became more than a missing person. He was a warning embedded in collective memory, an example of the mountain's rules, and what happened to those who failed to respect them, or who crossed unknowingly into places that refused to be crossed. The strange thing was that these psychological effects didn't diminish over time. They didn't fade as survivors rationalized them. Instead, they persisted, a quiet, nagging proof that the forest remembered those who had entered, and might still be calling them back. For some, that memory was enough to keep them away from the trails forever. For others, it became a quiet obsession, an urge to understand, map, or record. And for the unlucky few, it was a prelude, a brush with something that might not release its hold entirely. Henry Knight's disappearance was no longer just about a man lost in the woods. It was about the forest itself, patient, ancient, and alive in ways humans could not measure, but could feel. Months after Henry Knight vanished, reports began trickling in from hikers and locals in regions of Appalachia miles away from his last known location. At first, each seemed isolated. Unconnected tales of hikers momentarily disappearing from trails, radios cutting out without explanation, backpacks found far from where they should have been. But over time, a pattern emerged. In one valley, a solo backpacker checked in over radio at 1:45 p.m., planning a short hike along a ridge. At 1:52 p.m., her friend attempted to contact her. Silence. By the time search teams arrived, she had left her pack neatly arranged on a cliffside 20 miles from the trailhead. Food and first aid supplies untouched, boots removed and carefully placed beside the pack. No footprints leading to or from the cliff. In another report, a group of hunters went missing for precisely 7 minutes before returning to the trail. They reported losing all sense of distance, of time, and hearing faint voices calling from the woods. Voices they later realized were echoes of their own friends' calls from earlier in the day. Local rangers began noticing similarities that were impossible to ignore. Sudden, unnatural silence. Disorientation in otherwise familiar terrain. Personal items appearing in inaccessible places. Radio and compass malfunctions. Veteran searchers, some of whom had participated in Henry Knight's case, began whispering about the stretch, the name they gave the phenomenon of time and space bending in these areas. Not all of them believed it, but every one of them had experienced the uncanny quiet, the brief impossibility of navigation, and the subtle feeling that something unseen had been observing. Some began to document these incidents unofficially, keeping maps and logs, trying to find connections between the locations. A chilling pattern emerged. Every disappearance or anomaly occurred along ancient ridgelines, unmarked trails, or forest hollows that had been mentioned in folklore. Places that had long been avoided, not because they were dangerous in the ordinary sense, but because the land itself seemed to react to human intrusion. Researchers would later describe the trend as a spatial-temporal anomaly, though no one could explain the mechanics. The locals, however, did not need labels. They understood instinctively that certain woods remembered, that certain ridges waited, and that certain voices, calm, familiar, and impossible, would call if you lingered too long. Henry Knight's disappearance had been the most publicized, but he was far from the first, and the pattern suggested he would not be the last. By the time the search for Henry Knight officially ended, the story had transformed into something larger than a single disappearance. Experienced hikers, locals, and even skeptics all began speaking in the same cautious tones. There were places in the Appalachians where maps failed to represent reality, where compasses spun uselessly, where time felt compressed or stretched, and where silence was not merely the absence of sound but a presence in itself. Those who ventured too far into these zones reported feelings they could not describe, sensations that were more than fear, a weight pressing at the edges of thought, a pull drawing attention away from safety, a whisper of inevitability in the forest's rhythm. Some likened it to stepping into a dream that had rules you did not yet understand, and that would not let you leave unchanged. Even the search dogs, trained to track scent over miles and across streams and rocks, refused to proceed past certain boundaries. Trainers admitted it publicly, quietly emphasizing caution, but the implication was obvious. The mountain, or whatever resided in its depths, was selective. It allowed some paths, denied others. It did not act randomly. Investigators speculated endlessly. Temporal anomaly, hallucinatory episodes induced by isolation, even clandestine human activity. But all explanations faltered when confronted with the inexplicable evidence. Backpacks placed in unreachable locations, boots removed with deliberation, radio transmissions repeating after a person had vanished, eyewitness accounts of voices that should not have existed. For those who studied the phenomenon, one thought was unavoidable. The forest was patient, deliberate, and ancient beyond measurement. It had patterns humans could recognize, but never fully predict. Henry Knight had crossed its threshold, and somewhere, deep in the hollows and ridges of the Appalachian wilderness, the forest remembered him. Not violently, not in malice, but in a way that defied logic and demanded respect. For anyone who walks those trails, the lesson was simple and terrifying. Presence is noticed. Attention is recorded. And sometimes, a man can vanish in the blink of an eye, not because of carelessness or predators or accidents, but because the mountain had quietly decided to take notice. Henry Knight didn't just get lost. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed him whole. And the question remains, one that no report can answer and no rational explanation can satisfy. Was Henry Knight claimed by the forest, or did he step into something that had been waiting for him all along? Years passed, and Henry Knight's disappearance became legend in the Appalachian region. Not the kind of story told for thrills or campfire scares, but the kind whispered in towns, in ranger stations, in the cabins of hunters who knew better than to test the mountain's patience. No trace of him was ever recovered. Backpacks continued to appear in impossible places. Radios continued to emit faint, human-like voices long after their owners had left. Hikers reported the same sudden, unnatural silence, the same distortion of space and time, and the same feeling that they were being observed. Always watched, always measured. Some locals called it the silence. Others, more superstitious, called it the mountain taking note. Investigators remained divided. Rational explanations existed in theory: accidents, animal interference, equipment failure. But each case defied those explanations in small, precise ways that no one could reconcile. Every disappearance, every anomalous event, followed the same pattern: abrupt, untraceable, and ultimately unresolved. The forest, it seemed, had rules humans could not see, and consequences they could not predict. People still hike those trails. Some avoid the areas entirely. Some, drawn by curiosity, ambition, or the thrill of challenge, venture into the forbidden hollows. They return with stories of the odd and impossible. Some do not return at all. Henry Knight became both a warning and a mystery, a man erased from the world, yet etched permanently into its consciousness. And the forest continues to wait, patient and deliberate, marking its boundaries in ways that no human can measure. So now, the question hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. When you walk through the Appalachian forest, are you simply hiking? Or is the forest, in its silence, watching you? And if it notices, will it let you leave?